patriotism, faith, national unity, education, fiscal responsibility, civility, the values that define America. Fascinating stories and talks from America-loving patriots dedicated to preserving freedom, opportunity, and justice. Welcome to the Friends and Fellow Citizens podcast. Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 87 of Friends and Fellow Citizens. I'm your host, Sherman Tylowski. Thank you all so much for listening to this Sacred Honor Series episode. This is episode number 11 because we are discussing the 11th signer of the Declaration of Independence, and that is Samuel Huntington of Connecticut. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe to our podcast, subscribe to our email list as well to get the latest notifications and news and announcements. We've got some new stuff coming later this year, so I hope that you will subscribe. You'll get the latest notifications. Great way to stay connected with our community and with the program itself. Today's episode is about a man I think is someone quite unique, but also someone who I think represents why public service is often among the least vocal. And when I say that, I mean that there are a number of individuals, I think, in our society and within our history who not only have done a lot of things for public service, for serving government or nonprofits or whatever to serve the greater good, but who have done so at a low-key level. This is not anywhere near Samuel Adams. I mean, Samuel Adams, I referred in my episode about him back in November of 2021. And while he wasn't all that crazy all the time, but he certainly was that patriot who was just the one to just go at it, at King George and at the Loyalists, at the Tories and the British government. But the gentleman this week is none of that. Now, he was very, very fervently against the coercive acts, against what King George was doing, but he was completely opposite of what Samuel Adams at least portrayed himself to be. Samuel Huntington was born in 1731. He was not one to have had a very formal education. He did do some school, but he was actually self-educated. And I personally admire a lot of these kinds of founders, a lot of these kinds of people, because certainly at that time, when education wasn't as standardized as we understand it now, it took a lot more of a sacrifice to not only get your education, but to have all that practical education too, of maybe working on a farm or serving as a selectman up in New England or somewhere along those lines. And Huntington was one to develop a lot of interest in law. And he was able to be admitted to the bar just a few years later, and he started to practice. And Huntington clearly was not a John Adams. I mean, Adams was the lawyer who was seemingly everywhere in the news, certainly in the press in Massachusetts and across the colonies. Huntington took a more calmer approach to things, but he did become fervently against the coercive acts, like I mentioned earlier. And what he did was that he was an outspoken critic, but he was able to also communicate and relate with those who were on the fence with independence. He eventually was serving in the upper house, in the governor's council, where he served until 1784. Before he was appointed the king's attorney for Connecticut in 1768, which was a big deal because even if someone like Huntington or like Adams or whoever was so fervently against what the British government was doing, there were at least some individuals who were able to kind of keep their cool. You know, you don't want to go out and just be like, all right, I'm just going to tear down this act. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. Even if someone felt that way, Huntington was one to really know how to navigate the political system. Not to be a jurist, but also to be someone to know how important it is to influence the elections and how to influence, I should say, the political atmosphere. and to be able to serve as a bridge between different factions. Note that during this time, a lot of those in the colonist side or the patriot side of things, not everyone was on board with the same kind of things. Some of them wanted to be completely breaking away from the British. Others were trying to go for a more transitory approach. And some others maybe were, I guess you could say, considered centrists, some who wanted to maintain some economic ties, understandably for those who were in certain trades. That obviously became untenable later on as the conflict ensued. But the point is that Huntington was part of this larger group of people who were trying to voice opposition, but also not to break ties. Huntington was later serving as the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court from 1784 until 1787. Now, we've jumped a bit further there, but he was well known to be someone who was continually in politics in his, will eventually be a state of the state of Connecticut. Do keep in mind, though, that when I say he was calmer, that didn't mean that he had more of a centrist, quote-unquote, centrist position on independence. He was quite adamant on his opposition. He obviously eventually became more on board with the independence movement, but he was one, I would say, who could use his words very wisely when he was communicating with loyalists, when he was communicating with those even in the Patriot movement. In 1775, the Connecticut Assembly decided to vote for him as one of the delegates to the Second Continental Congress. Then the following year, as we all know, that magic year, 1776, while the language was adopted on July 4th, on August 2nd, 1776, Samuel Huntington became the 11th signer of the Declaration of Independence. Now, let's look at Huntington's role a bit. I'm not going to go so much into depth of what he did during the Articles of Confederation and the eventually the Constitution, but there's one thing that one has to understand about Huntington. It was that at the time during this conflict, there were all these different episodes. If you think about the victories, when people were really, really excited or so happy, like, wow, like this is amazing, we're going to win. And then there were these lows. I'm like, oh my gosh, are you kidding me? This convoy of British soldiers just keeps coming, and Washington losing all these battles, and should we replace him? There was a lot of ups and downs, as one can imagine, during this entire conflict. And Huntington was one who wasn't one to say, oh my gosh, this is the end of the world. And part of the reason why is because he was very much involved in those intricate details, working out logistics for the Continental Army. He was, once again, constantly in contact with different colonies, different representatives, serving as that bridge between different factions or different interest groups. And he was also one to not be too optimistic, too. He didn't want to go out and say, all right, we got this, it's in the bag. And that would have been very, very disastrous, certainly in his mind, because he obviously saw the very details and the very numbers and logistics about military reserves, about the limited training, the limited ammunition that a lot of different militias had. And for Huntington to be able to fit this job, I think is very, very significant. Not to mention that after the victory at Saratoga on October 17th, 1777, there was a lot of its excitement and joy, and I'm sure Huntington felt the same way, but he also knew that there was still a lot of work ahead of him and ahead for the Continental Congress. And he worked incredibly hard every single day to be able to work on various different committees and be able to put together all those administrative tasks that really kept the Congress going and kept the whole independence movement going. When John Jay, another founder, was one time taking up another job, and he was essentially helping represent the colonies to the court of Spain, and he had to leave the office as the president of the Continental Congress. And Huntington had built up such a positive reputation that he was elected president of the Continental Congress on September 28th, 1779. Huntington proved to be a very, very important person as the role of the president of the Continental Congress. Now, while he eventually obviously never became president of the United States, which came a lot later than 1779, but he very much set a lot of precedent for how things were going to be run in this new body of government. Remember that at that point in 1779, the Articles of Confederation was still not available as a draft. Certainly the Constitution wasn't, and certainly the Bill of Rights weren't even formally constructive ideas at the time. But what he understood was that with such a young country, he knew he had to be a mediator, a calm mediator, that is, not flailing arms Samuel Adams at times, but he had to be that person who could confront, and not in a very direct way, not in a confrontational way, but to be able to negotiate and be able to compromise. A bit similar to what Roger Sherman had to deal with when it came to the Virginia and New Jersey plans, about those disputes between large states and small states. But Huntington wasn't most concerned about the disputes on how the legislature was going to be structured, although this debate certainly permeated throughout the Congress. It wasn't like he wasn't concerned. But the main issue that he dealt with, and something that I had read about but I didn't know was as big of a deal as it was he was dealing with land disputes. Sounds like fun, right? Especially when basically no one has any idea where the borders are. So Huntington was taking on this job of helping to get the Articles of Confederation passed. I won't get too much into the whole process of the Articles of Confederation getting ratified, but I'm going to use an analogy here to help illustrate perhaps how messy this whole process was. It's kind of like dealing with a bunch of kids fighting over a jar of candy. You had a kid named Virginia who said, "Oh, I think this one's mine because I'm the biggest kid, or I'm one of the biggest kids." And then you got New York say, "Well, hold on here. I'm the one who should be getting this piece of candy." And then there's Pennsylvania, and then there's Massachusetts and Connecticut, and all these different colonies just fighting over, like, wait, but Mom said that this candy is for me and that candy is for you, and you're wrong, I'm right. Then another kid says, no, you guys are all wrong. You don't know what you're talking about. Dad said that this should be the actual, and these candies should be for me. And that kind of was like that. Imagine just almost like the pettiest fights that you can imagine. But that was what these land disputes were like. Essentially, the disputes were one about essentially different states stepping on each other's feet on where borders were. But that really stemmed from the fact that these colonies didn't agree on how these borders were drawn, because a lot of these borders were drawn at the time when King George was around. Well, after the Revolutionary War, and when this process of ratification for the Articles of Confederation were to come about, well, then some of these people say, well, these borders, they were drawn such a long time ago, they don't matter anymore. I'm just going to draw it how I want it. And it just became such a logjam, and all the lobbying and the negotiations and disputes, and Huntington was probably just a breath of fresh air for all of these people. And so there's one case when Maryland really, really got upset. They were like, we are not ratifying this thing at all. The Articles of Confederation, we are not ratifying this at all until the lands in where Western Ohio is, or where Ohio would be, until those lands are settled, we're not going to ratify this. And now this posed a very big problem, because even though the Articles of Confederation did not become the entirely system of government that we know of today, but the idea that one colony could sink the entire project was constantly on the minds of the founders. Huntington had a very tough job. As the president of the Continental Congress, it was his responsibility and his obligation to try and settle an agreement with the leaders of the states of New York, Virginia, and Connecticut. And basically to tell them, saying, look, all these disputes that you have about who got what land under King George, this doesn't matter anymore. And he literally told him, I said, this is dumb. You've got to be able to look at what the future can hold. You've got to be able to sort these disputes out. We have to have a better system of distributing land and of setting territorial disputes. And finally, after a lot of negotiations and after so many talks, finally those disputed lands eventually were ceded to the national government. And this really kind of ties in a lot with maybe why Huntington was a Federalist. Again, the Federalists were the ones who wanted a stronger national government to be able to settle things. Certainly was very necessary, I would argue, at the time when you had all these colonial disputes on things like land. One state saying, "No, the shrub is mine, and that bush is yours." Like these kinds of petty arguments really had to come to a solution. And Huntington was, as the president of the Continental Congress, he did a very, very strong job in ensuring that Maryland was able to ratify the Articles on March 1st, 1781, but he was also able to give confidence and faith to those states, even the states who probably still wanted that shrub. He gave them confidence that there was going to be a better way to have those political battles and have those disputes and negotiations after there is unity for a national government and where there's unity for a United States of America. Huntington was one who had a remarkable work ethic. He was not always in the best health, but he was still able to carry on. He eventually had to leave his position, though, and return to Connecticut on July 9th, 1781, because of his poor health. But even though he had to leave, he really received a lot of respect from the other signers. Huntington decided to obviously leave, and this was at the time when Cornwallis surrendered to the American and French forces at Yorktown. Obviously very, very significant. What Huntington did after that, though, is something to remark. Obviously recall that the French were very much involved, and that was just part because of the work of Ben Franklin and the other delegates who helped serve for the colonies overseas. Huntington was also important to recognize and do what he could in his power to recognize the efforts that the French made in the American cause. He wrote to a man named Chevalier de la Luzerne, the minister of France, basically like a representative of France to the colonies. And this is what he wrote. He wrote, quote, "I cannot deny myself the pleasure of congratulating you, sir, on the important and glorious success of our combined forces on the complete capture of Lord Cornwallis and all his army. The conduct of the Comte de Grasse, so far as it hath come to my knowledge, charms me. His drubbing the British feet sufficient to teach them to stay at due distance, not again attempt to interrupt the siege and main objectives. May our successes this campaign be in proportion to the generous and unparalleled aids received from His Most Christian Majesty, and prove eventually productive of the happiest consequences to the perpetual advantage of both nations." Unquote. Huntington, even though he was out of that position of power, was able to convey that message, certainly as the former president of the Continental Congress, to be able to convey that message of unity to the French, to thank them for their efforts. Certainly there were a lot of other initiatives that were happening later on with Lafayette coming over. I don't know how involved Huntington was with any kind of future plans for Lafayette to come back. Lafayette didn't come back till a lot later, but I'm just saying when it comes to the building those relations with France, certainly were very challenging when the French Revolution came about. But nonetheless, Huntington should be credited for ensuring and reminding people that this effort certainly required the help of foreign allies who were trying to achieve a common objective. Later on, Huntington was not sleeping on his laurels. He eventually served as lieutenant governor of Connecticut from 1784 to 1786, and eventually he was so popular in instituting a lot of the bedrock for Connecticut politics that he eventually became the governor, the 18th governor of Connecticut from 1786 to his death in 1796. During that time, he even, I guess it's one of those transferable skills that he kept on his resume, but this land dispute thing, he probably not only got a letter of recognition for it, he probably recognized that, hey, I'm actually pretty darn good at this. And he helped with the Treaty of Hartford, which helped resolve some more land claims between New York and Massachusetts, which I don't think was very easy, but he either enjoyed it or he was really good at it. So, or maybe both. So, he was just very, very good at mediating these land disputes from his experience as the president of the Continental Congress. And like I said, he was very much influential in setting up what Connecticut is nowadays in terms of where the capital is in Hartford. On January 5th, 1796, Samuel Huntington passed away in Norwich, Connecticut, and his beloved hometown, a town where his political career just got started, but really got him to where he was. And he passed away at the age of 64. I think Samuel Huntington brings out a lot of different lessons here, but I've condensed it down to 3, as I usually do for my episodes. Number 1 is, I really feel like Huntington demonstrated this a lot in his actions and his work, but national unity, I think, is very much at the core of public service here in America. Regardless of what people's political differences are, it seems like the people we read about in history and the people who we admire the most, there's so many times when we see them and we recognize that they were looking at the national interests. I'll never forget in 2008 when John McCain lost the presidential election and he recognized the importance of doing what he could to help the president of the United States achieve his objectives, even though it was a very hard-fought campaign. It was a tough time economically and politically for the United States. But there have been so many times when I think back of someone like Senator McCain and some other people who in history have decided, you know what, I'm going to let go of these disputes or these disagreements that I have, at least for the time being, bring them up when necessary, but to ensure that when an election happens or when something major happens, when a dispute is resolved, we ensure that national unity is placed at the top of our to-do list. Huntington really did that with the Western land claims and disputes. I don't think it was very much a particularly easy job or maybe a desirable job to deal with territorial disputes. You can imagine all the lobbying with the different states wanting to use different ways to tax on land and the obviously economic development issues. So there's just a lot of different elements, but I never thought that land use or land and territorial disputes would be such a critical motivator for someone to continue in public service, like Samuel Huntington. Huntington understood that this young nation needed to have some sort of national unity. While the Articles of Confederation failed pretty miserably, he was nonetheless very instrumental in ensuring that continuity of national unity and that faith in a national government and a society built on a nation could continue with the passage of the Constitution. While national unity sounds idealistic, it really is a spirit or a culture that requires so many people to be able to maintain. And I hope that regardless of whichever town or state or county or whichever time zone you're in, we recognize the importance of putting the national interest first and to be able to settle those disputes and settle those disagreements at a much more appropriate time when necessary. And that kind of leads me a little bit into the second takeaway here, which is that setting aside some of those domestic disagreements that we have as a nation, we must really recognize the support and the generosity and the work of foreign allies when it comes to fighting for common goals and objectives. This could not be more so in this day and age with the current Russian invasion of Ukraine. And it's incredibly sad to see what's going on there. And I don't need to get too much into detail for all of us to understand that, but to see that there is quite a lot of unity amongst so many different Western nations, even nations that are not traditionally part of the Western Hemisphere, to be able to be part of this coalition to support Ukraine, but also to counteract and stop a lot of Russian oligarchs and from the Russian regime to be able to profit from almost anything. That is a remarkable achievement I think we need to address. Not to mention, I was speaking with some people about the Russian invasion on Ukraine. One of the points I made, and this is something that I got from a former professor who was an ambassador to Latvia and Kazakhstan, two countries that emerged from the fall of the Soviet Union, and is that we really need to recognize how important allies like Poland and the Baltic states are to this movement of supporting Ukraine. For so many years, I read in an article recently about how Poland has been so vocal about Russia for all these years, and finally they're having that opportunity to be heard. The professor I used to have, his name is Professor Larry Napper. He is a remarkable professor, and public servant who taught me a lot about Russian politics, about U.S.-Russia relations. But he was one, I think, to make me realize in a simulation, out of all things, I once did a simulation in his class representing the Estonian foreign government, speaking with then Secretary, my classmate who was representing the United States. And when I started this project, I was like, I don't know where to start. Like, I don't know anything about Estonian politics, whatever. Then I realized that this small country, out of the bunch of three there, the Baltic states, are all NATO members. They all contribute a lot to cybersecurity. They understand the Russian threat probably better than anyone else besides Ukraine. They harbor a lot of great values on freedom and on representation and on economic development. And throughout this conflict, I've thought about all those years, even despite the mistakes and many errors that we have made with regards to our relations with Russia and with Ukraine, and how we could have supported Ukraine in so many more ways. But it's important to recognize the work that countless diplomats, countless people in government and in the private sector, all those people who have contributed to ensuring that those three Baltic states, instead of being overrun by Russian tanks and by just sheer numbers, the people of those three Baltic states, while they are obviously very, very concerned about what's happening, but the fact that they are NATO members is the result of countless years of hard work and effort to ensure that the people there can be safe from the Russian military. It is remarkable to think that who knew, right? From that point in time when the fall of the Soviet Union collapsed, who knew that these nations could work so hard to ensure NATO membership? Now they're part of a large security alliance. And this is what I really mean when I say that we need to recognize those foreign efforts to join in on these bigger causes, because when we start to set aside some of these differences with some other nations, it's understandable why we come from the positions that we have. But to be able to contribute to these larger efforts in counteracting Russia, on China, and on other adversarial nations, that in itself should be something we should recognize, and one that is a conglomerate of various different achievements under many administrations, and something that maybe Samuel Huntington will be able to recognize, chip in and say, I think we are doing the right thing, and we hope that we'll continue to build on those relations, those positive relations with our allies. And then the other aspect too is really just recognizing other allies too, recognizing even people whom we might have disagreements with, recognizing that they too also want fair elections, or they want a safer homeland, or they want to have a more prosperous economy, or they want people to be rewarded for their hard work. All these things we can identify those values when we work together with one another. This fits incredibly well with the final point here, which is regardless of the political climate, I think there's always room to have some calm and mediation in our politics. Whether it's a calm mediator person from like someone like Samuel Huntington or someone else in this day and age, I do believe there is a role for those who are not as vocal, physically. Like they are not ones to go out and make speeches or do any kind of public speaking. I do think that there is a role for a lot of people in civics, even though politics is one that is a lot about speaking and a lot about getting to know one another. And certainly Huntington, as someone who was not as well educated as other people in terms of formal education, as someone who maybe wasn't as charismatic as others, he was still able to meet people, get to know one another, get to be someone whom others can trust. And that really is the key thing, is even if you're someone who is a bit more timid, or if you know someone who is a bit more timid, but that person or yourself may want to get into civics, there are important roles for you. This country needs your voice, needs your effort to be able to galvanize, to be able to work with other people, to be able to build coalitions, and to be able to work on administrative tasks or logistics tasks to more creative projects. And there's just so many options out there. If we as a nation can get as many people of different strengths and backgrounds to be able to connect with one another, to be able to bring about more civility in our politics, to be able to have more conversation, to be able to interact with one another again after 2+ years of the pandemic, we can bring about much needed calm and positive change for our political environment now and in the future. And with that, I hope you enjoyed our episode about Samuel Huntington, the second delegate from Connecticut and the 11th signer of the Declaration of Independence. Make sure, once again, to subscribe to our podcast to get the latest content and notifications. Enjoy the rest of your day, and remember, a day in America is always better when we are with our friends and fellow citizens. I'll see you next time.